Shalom and welcome to Through the Book of Hebrews. This is one of a series of video teachings that we're doing that take you through a book of the scriptures. And in this case, we're going through the book of Hebrews. We're not doing these in order, but they'll eventually, I'm sure, be placed in scriptural order. In order of the books of the scriptures. However, right now we're just producing them as there is need in the community, and more in that order. And so we've already done through the book of Romans, and we've done through the book of Galatians, and you can see those by going to NazareneJudaism.com. They're also on YouTube. In fact, the NazareneJudaism.com is actually embedded from YouTube. The videos. However, if you go to NazareneJudaism.com, you'll also be able to download the downloadable PDF file of the handouts for the class. And these classes have lots of good, valuable handouts. In fact, I recommend putting them in hole punching them and putting them in a 3-ring binder and collecting them and keeping them, because they're very, very valuable, concise information about these books. And so the book of Hebrews is the book. One of the things we're going to be doing with this book, as we have done with the other books of the so-called New Testament, which I prefer to call the Ketuvim Netzarim, that is the writings of the Nazarenes, is to look at these books in their original Hebrew and Aramaic in light of Second Temple era Judaism, based upon information that we can draw from the rabbinic literature, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the writings of Philo, the writings of Josephus, etc. And so our concept is to look at these books in the light of continuity with Judaism as they were originally intended, and especially as is the case with the book of Hebrews. Okay, so our first handout is titled Original Language of Hebrews. And so that's the first thing I want to address. What is the original language of Hebrews? Now, when we study this book, we're going to be referring to we may be referring to different texts. I'm not sure how the class will progress, but I fully expect that I may refer to the Hebrew text of Hebrews, which was published by Sebastian Münster in 1557, and which we republished for the first time in Hebrew and in English, which you can get at by going to NazareneSpace.com. That's NazareneSpace.com, and clicking on books and DVDs, and you can purchase the letter to the Hebrews from an old Hebrew text. So we have the Hebrew text of Hebrews that was obtained by Sebastian Münster. We'll talk about that in a minute. We have the Peshitta Aramaic text and the CPA Aramaic version, and we also have, of course, the Greek version of the book of Hebrews. So, the so-called church fathers all seem to admit that the book of Hebrews was written in Hebrew. Clement of Alexandria, for example, is cited. He wrote in the very late 2nd century and the very early 3rd century, and he is referred to by Eusebius in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, Book 6, Chapter 14, Section 2. And Eusebius refers to a work of Clement of Alexandria called Hypotyposis. And he says, in the work called Hypotyposis, to sum up the matter briefly, he, Clement of Alexandria, has given us abridged accounts of all the canonical scriptures. And then after a bit he says, the epistle to the Hebrews, he asserts, was written by Paul, and we're going to talk about that too in just a few minutes. Written by Paul to the Hebrews in the Hebrew tongue, but that it was carefully translated by Luke and published among the Greeks. Eusebius himself, on his own authority, says in Ecclesiastical History, Book 3, Chapter 38, sections 2 through 3, for as Paul has addressed the Hebrews in the language of his country, some say that the evangelist Luke and others that Clement translated it. That would be Clement of Alexandria, of course. And then Jerome, in 382, around 382, Eusebius wrote in the early 4th century. Jerome writes around the late 4th century. He, Paul, being a Hebrew, wrote in Hebrew, that is, his own tongue, and most fluently, while things which were eloquently written in Hebrew were more eloquently turned into Greek. Now, if one compares the Hebrew text of the book of Hebrews with the Greek text of the book of Hebrews, one will come to the clear conclusion that one or the other is a paraphrase. Either the Greek is original and the Hebrew is a paraphrase, or the Hebrew is original and the Greek is a paraphrase. But the translation is from one to the other appears somewhat paraphrastic, not extremely, not like the Targums or even the Living Bible as a paraphrase, but the grammar has certainly in the Greek version is quite Greek, and the Hebrew grammar is quite Hebrew. And so Jerome is saying that from his church father perspective in the late 4th century, that while the Hebrew is written eloquently, the Greek's even more eloquent. It's even better in the Greek, is what he's trying to say. So, but he's admitting that it was originally written in Hebrew. Now, in 1537, Sebastian Münster published the Hebrew text of the book of Matthew, and which he had obtained from among the Jews. And this is very similar to the Dutillé Hebrew version of Matthew, for those who are familiar with these things. And 20 years later, in 1557, excuse me, a second edition of his text of Hebrew Matthew was published, and this time with the text of Hebrew Hebrews that he had obtained from amongst the Jews. And it remained almost forgotten, this 1557 publication of the Hebrew text of Hebrews, until we uncovered it and published it for the first time in hundreds of years, and for the first time ever with an English translation some years ago. So also, for those of you that are following our Project Devar at our Hebrew Aramaic NT.com site, where we're putting the Hebrew and Aramaic New Testament manuscripts up online, interlinear with Strong's word numbers. This Hebrews is one of the texts that we're going to be putting, in fact we put the first 2 verses, I believe already, up online, interlinear, keyed to the Strong's word numbers. So it'll be available to you. Excuse me. And by the way, if you'd like to support that project and the other work that we're doing, this is all this material is available free. It's made available by people like you who make donations to support this work with their tithes, offerings, and just donations. So please strongly consider donating to this work. No one else is doing this kind of work the way that we're doing it. And you can do that by going to NazareneSpace.com or NazareneJudaism.com or Hebrew Aramaic NT, and I think it's .com. It might be .org, but I think it's .com. And any of those sites, excuse me, you click on the PayPal box in the upper right-hand corner to donate, or you can make donations to by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. That's donations@wnae.org. Excuse me. Or you can mail them to P.O. Box 471. That's to Nazarene Judaism. Sorry, made out to Nazarene Judaism at Nazarene Judaism, P.O. Box 471, Hurst, Texas 76053. Okay, so our next handout. Remember I said before that when Clement of Alexandria had said that Paul wrote the book, I'm sorry, when Eusebius had said that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews, that we would be talking about that. There's a big controversy over who wrote the book of Hebrews. So that's our next handout, who wrote the book of Hebrews. For a number of reasons, I'm going to put forward in this study that Paul is the author of the book of Hebrews, and I have 6 reasons that I'm laying out here. Number 1, Clement of Alexandria and Eusebius both maintain that Paul wrote the book. We just covered that. Number 2, most of the ancient New Testament manuscripts, excuse me, most ancient New Testament manuscripts place the book of Hebrews with the Pauline epistles, as does the Peshitta Aramaic version of the New Testament. Number 3, from 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, it appears that Paul had written a letter to the Hebrews, and if we and that becomes apparent when we compare 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 1 with James chapter 1, verse 1 as to the group that 2 Peter was written to, was the Hebrews, and in 2 Peter 3:15 it appears that Paul had previously had written these people a book in the past. Reason number 4, Pauline authorship is supported by the fact that the author was in bonds, according to chapter 10, verse 34, in Italy, chapter 13, verse 24, and that Timothy was one of his companions, according to chapter 13, verse 23. So all of this fits Paul to a T. Verse 5, the author treats the subject, verse 5, reason number 5, the author treats the subject of inheritance in detail, which is something we'll talk a lot about as we study the book. Paul had been commissioned to teach on the topic of inheritance, as we read in Acts chapter 26, verses 12 through 18. That was specifically what he was commissioned by Elohim to do, to write about inheritance, or to teach about the topic of inheritance. And it is only in the Pauline epistles, the concept of only in this book is the topic of inheritance dealt with in such great detail. It is really, as we'll find out, integral to the message of the book of Hebrews. And number 6, the author's expert use of the 7 rules of Hillel, which are basic rules, fundamental rules of Jewish hermeneutics that were codified by Hillel the Great at the time that Yeshua was a child. That Hillel didn't create them, he simply documented and wrote them down. Hillel, of course, Paul, according to Acts chapter 22, verse 3, was a student of Gamaliel. Gamaliel was the grandson of Hillel. So it's very, very fitting that Paul would have such expert use not only of the 7 rules of Hillel, as we'll find out, and I will point out his usage of them in this study, but also homiletic midrashic exegesis, the structural forms of rabbinic exegesis. Paul uses them expertly as well, all of which points to Paul, the student of Gamaliel, the grandson of Hillel. Gamaliel himself being Nasi of the Sanhedrin. Okay, so our next handout is the Ebionite Essene audience of the book of Hebrews. If Paul wrote the book of Hebrews, who did he write it to? And this also will answer a lot of questions. This is my theory, and it's based upon a great deal of years of research and understanding. So I lay this out for you. Paul begins his epistle by showing that the Messiah is greater than angels, and that's significant because the Essenes and the Ebionites both had a high esteem for angels and a lot of high angelology, if you will. Moreover, the Ebionites held to a low Christology. In other words, they didn't believe in the deity of Messiah. They had this idea that that Yeshua was really just a man, so Paul is arguing in Hebrews chapter 1 for a high Christology. In other words, he's arguing that Messiah is more than an angel and certainly more than your average man or any man. Okay. Also, Paul goes on to present Yeshua as a priestly Messiah after the order of Melchizedek, and gives an argument as to how one from the tribe of Judah could be in every way a priest. This is significant because the Qumran community were anticipating two messiahs, a priestly Messiah from the Aaronic line and a kingly Messiah from the Davidic line. When Paul centers his argument strategically around Melchizedek, who was both a priest and a king. And that's important because the Qumran community believed in a coming Melchizedek figure, which we will talk about a lot in this study, in this series on Hebrews, because it's key. It's called 11Q13. It's the Melchizedek document. This Melchizedek figure would help Israel receive their inheritance, which ties into the inheritance theme, and whose work is tied to the Day of Atonement, which is central, as you'll find out, to the book of Hebrews. And moreover, the Qumran community identified this Melchizedek figure as El, Elohim, and as Yahweh himself. So there's a high Christology issue here. And Paul makes all the same identifications with Yeshua. Another evidence that the intended audience were Ebionite Essenes, in other words, Essenes that were sort of proto-Ebionites, because the Ebionites didn't exist yet. The Ebionites split from the Nazarenes in 70 CE, but they came out of this sort of Essene group that became believers in Yeshua, but some of them never gave up a lot of their Essene ideas that were not necessarily in harmony with Nazarene Judaism. So the Essenes and the Ebionites, this is one of the ideas which was not in harmony with Nazarene Judaism. They both repudiated the temple ceremonies. The Essenes argued that the priesthood of the temple was corrupt, and they refused to participate in the sacrificial offerings as a result. In fact, they believed that the Shekinah had departed from the temple and had followed them out into the wilderness. The Ebionites maintained that Yeshua had come to abolish the sacrifices. Now, that's familiar because a lot of Christians teach that today. The Ebionites taught that. And Paul argues in favor of the temple sacrifices, apparently giving an alternate explanation of Psalm 40, verses 6 through 8, and we'll talk about this when we get to this part of Hebrews, which is likely an Essene and Ebionite proof text. In other words, he's apparently refuting an Essene Ebionite interpretation of Psalm 40, verses 6 through 8, that we don't have today. Paul's midrash on Psalm 40, 6 through 8, ties in with two other passages that don't exist anymore. Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34, that talk about the new covenant, and Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 3 through 4, that talk about the just shall live by faith. And we'll talk about this again in more detail when we get to these passages in Hebrews. The Qumran community believed their community had become partakers of the new covenant of Jeremiah 31, and they believed that Habakkuk 2:4 related to the teacher of righteousness, which was the founder of their sect of Judaism, if you will, Essenism. So this is Paul. Paul is definitely seems to be engaging these Essenes. The Qumran community also, as we talked about, used Habakkuk 2:3-4 as a proof text, but they saw the just shall live by faith, but they saw the faith in the passage as being faith in the teacher of righteousness who had founded their sect, and Paul applies the same text, of course, to trust in Elohim in and through the Messiah. In Hebrews, Paul twice cites Psalm chapter 2, verse 7 in reference to the Messiah. And Paul seems to tie the verse to the idea of the Messiah as a priest. The passage is also applied to Yeshua in the Ebionite version of the Good News according to the Hebrews, in an account of Yeshua's immersion by John the Baptist. This is significant for two reasons. The immersion took place when Yeshua was approximately 30 years old, which is the same age at which priests were immersed as part of their initiation into the priesthood. It's also significant that the Ebionites used this story to argue for a low Christology. They argued that Yeshua was a man who was entered into by the Spirit of Messiah at the time that he was immersed, and the Spirit entered into him as a dove. Okay, and this is a doctrine called adoptionism today. Okay, so they argue that for a low Christology based on this. Paul in Hebrews also cites 2 Samuel 7:14 as a messianic prophecy, and while rabbinic Jewish documents never cite this passage as a messianic prophecy, the Dead Sea Scrolls do use the verse as a messianic prophecy. So again, this is engaging with the Essenes. Finally, Paul did not sign his letter to the Hebrews because his signature would add only negative weight to such a document. Paul was a Pharisee. In fact, he says, I am a Pharisee in the book of Acts. He was, as we said, the student of Gamaliel, the grandson of Hillel. He would not have added anything but negative authority to a letter written to the Essenes. They would have tuned him out as a Pharisee. He wanted his letter to be read and comprehended, if you will, considered on its own authority, on its own merits. And of course, for these same reasons, by the way, the Ebionites, when they did emerge in 70 CE, they repudiated Paul altogether as a false prophet. Okay. So then we have the date and occasion of the writing of the book. When was the book of Hebrews written and why? The probable occasion for the writing of the Hebrews was the martyrdom of Yaakov HaTzadik, James the Just, in 63 CE. In 63 CE, we have two good reasons for this. One, in 63 CE, Paul was in bonds, according to Hebrews 10:34, and in Italy, according to Hebrews 13:24. That's in keeping with Acts chapter 28. So Paul is in the right place at the right time, writing, if we take these passages together, to be writing at the time of Yaakov HaTzadik's execution. Two, Paul's audience in 63 CE at the martyrdom of their leader Yaakov Tzaddik could easily have viewed themselves as being oppressed, which his audience, according to the epistle in chapter Hebrews 10, 32 through 34, and chapter 12, verse 4, did in fact see themselves as oppressed. And they would need exhortation that Paul gives them in chapter 13, verse 22, and endurance and confidence in chapter 10, verses 35 through 36. Paul also famously tells them not to forsake the gathering of themselves together, as has become the custom of some. And that makes perfect sense because in context, as we'll find out as we go through the book, he's talking there about the temple, going to the temple. And so he's saying that since James the Just had been martyred there at the temple, on the temple grounds, that it would make perfect sense that believers of his time period, of exactly that time period, would be afraid of going to the temple, and that he's encouraging them not to be afraid to do so. He wasn't saying, oh, don't forget to go to church, because of course churches didn't exist yet. The theme of the book of Hebrews is our next handout. Of course, there was a handout when we just covered date and occasion of Hebrews. So now we're on the theme of the book of Hebrews, and I know we're going through a lot of material and a lot of handouts here before we even start looking at the actual book of Hebrews. Okay? So we have the theme of the book of Hebrews. Paul's topic in the book of Hebrews is the blood covenant and inheritance. He shows that the Messiah was made heir of all things, according to chapter 1, verse 2 and verse 4. He was the firstborn, according to chapter 1, verse 6, and chapter 12, verse 23. That's important. That's an inheritance term. And we'll talk about that when we get to chapter 12, verse 23 in our study. But the term Bikur in Hebrew, firstborn, is a special inheritance term because the firstborn inherits a double portion. He shows that the oath which made Abraham's seed the chosen people was a covenant in chapter 6, verses 13 through 14, and that the oath which makes the Messiah a priest after the order of Melchizedek, chapter 7, verses 20 through 22, is the new covenant. And that's in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 22, chapter 8, verses 16 through 13. He also shows that this is a blood covenant sealed with the Messiah's blood, as we see in Hebrews chapters 8 and 9. And Paul argues that because of this covenant relationship, we have an inheritance. And that's really where he gets to the climax in chapter 9, verses 11 through 22. We're going to cover this all in more detail as we go line by line through the whole book. So, since we are blood covenantors with the Messiah, who is the heir of all things, we inherit with him. And to Paul, this inheritance is the rest of Psalm 95, verses 7 through 11. The theme of the book has to do with inheritance. Okay, so next we're going to look at the outline of the book of Hebrews. And that's our next handout, outline of the book of Hebrews. And this is the one of the easiest books to outline because the entire book is an extended proem homiletic midrash on Psalm 110. Now, proem homiletic midrash is a particular kind of midrashic exegesis, which we will talk about in detail. This is an extended proem homiletic midrash, and it's a midrash on Psalm 110. the entire book of Hebrews is a midrash on Psalm 110. That's key. Okay, and a proem homiletic midrash introduces a text, and then what it does is it introduces two texts at least, sometimes a series of texts that are connected with certain key words or key ideas. Usually, hopefully, the best examples, actual key words that tie the passages and ideas together, and then the exposition on the text is exploring and using Scripture to interpret Scripture, using one passage to help understand the other or others. So we see in this outline that we have a series of sub-midrashim, if you will, that are dealing with different parts of the text. And we'll deal with those in detail as we go through the book. Okay, so you definitely want to hold on this handout through the entire study. How are we doing on time here? Okay, we now are going to look at the prologue, the first 4 verses of the book of Hebrews. This is really before it gets into the extended midrash. So let's begin with chapter 1, verse 1. I'm going to read here from the King James Version, but we're also then going to look at the actual Hebrew text. So the King James Version says, God, who at sundry times and in diverse manners spoke in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things. He's already getting into the inheritance issue here. The Son is the heir of all things. That is number 1. So he has in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made all the worlds. Who, being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of the majesty on high. Verse 3. We're going to look at verse 3 of the Hebrew here in a minute. It's got some very interesting things in the Hebrew. And then verse 4, being made so much better than the angels, as he has by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. Now verse 4 is also sort of beginning of the opening midrash, because verse 4 introduces the idea that the Messiah is of a higher order than angels. There are those that teach the Messiah was just an angel. The Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, say that he was the Archangel Michael, and nothing other than, nothing beyond that. However, the book of Hebrews is very clear that he wasn't just an angel. He was of a higher order than angels. So let's look at verse 3 now in the Hebrew. And we have a handout on this, by the way, titled, He is the Brightness of His Glory. And in the Hebrew, turn to the Hebrew here, it says, through appointment, He is the brightness of His glory, and He is the maker of all things by the power of His word, and who has accomplished by His power the cleansing of our sins. Behold, He sits in the high places to the right hand of the Shekinah. Okay, that's how the Hebrew reads. So the word for, when it says the brightness of His glory, the original Hebrew of the Minster Hebrew text of Hebrews, the word for brightness is Zohar. He is the Zohar, it says. of his kavod, by the way. And kavod is also the word for glory there in the Hebrew. Okay, so what is the Zohar? This is a very important word in Judaism. So I want to kind of explore what this word really means. It's used only twice in the Tanakh. The first place it's used that I want to look at is Daniel chapter 12, verse 3. It says in Daniel 12:3, "And they that are wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn the many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever." The word for brightness there is Zohar. So it says, they shall shine as the Zohar of the firmament. The other place, where this word appears in the Tanakh is Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 2, where it says, "And I behold a likeness, behold a likeness as the appearance of fire from the appearance of his loins downward, fire, and from his loins upward as the appearance of brightness, as the color of electrum." This is describing what's called a Maaseh Merkavah in Judaism. In Jewish mysticism, it is an account of the divine throne chariot. Okay? And Ezekiel sees a figure on the throne. And this figure is described as the appearance of Zohar. Okay? That brings us to his Ezekiel's initial vision of this Merkavah in chapter 1, verses 22 through 28. So let's look at Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 22 through 28. He says, "And over the heads of the living creatures there was the likeness of a firmament, like the color of the terrible ice, stretched forth over their heads above. And under the firmament were their wings conformable, and one to the other. This one of them had two which covered, and that one of them had two which covered their bodies. And when they went, I heard the noise of their wings like the noise of great waters, like the voice of Shaddai, a voice of tumult, like the noise of a host. When they stood, they let down their wings. And when there was a voice above the firmament that was over their heads, as they stood, they let down their wings. And above the firmament that was over their heads was the likeness of a throne, as the appearance of a sapphire stone. And upon the likeness of the throne was a likeness as the appearance of a man upon it above." This is the figure that he says in chapter 8, verse 2, is the appearance of Zohar. So you see there's this very high Christology idea being applied with this word Zohar. "And I saw as the color of electrum, as the appearance of fire round about enclosing it, from the appearance of his loins upward, and from the appearance of his loins and downward, I saw as it were the appearance of fire, and there was brightness round about him. As the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud, and the day of rain, so was the appearance of the brightness round about. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of Yahweh. And when I saw it, I fell upon my face, and I heard a voice of one that spoke." So by using this word Zohar, Paul is indicating that the Messiah is a personification or incarnation of this figure that Ezekiel saw on the throne. And going back to the original Hebrew here, you'll note that it says, he is the brightness of his glory, and he is the maker of all things by the power of his word, who places to the right hand of the Shekinah. And in the Greek here, it says, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person. I believe that's also in the Aramaic. He's the express image of his person. The word person there in the Greek is hypostasis, which is a very interesting word if you do studies on the concept of the deity of Messiah and so on. So the firmament mentioned in Daniel, which is above the four living creatures in Ezekiel 1:22, is the brightness of this likeness that's sitting on the throne. They're the same thing. And in this brightness, which is the namesake of the book, this is the namesake, by the way, there's a book called the Zohar in Judaism, which is several volumes long. It's the primary text of Kabbalah, and the Zohar is the name of this text. In the book called the Zohar, okay, we read in volume 1, page 15, column A, through 15, column B, we read something very interesting about this Zohar that's talked about in the book of Daniel 12:3 and in Ezekiel. It says, "It is written, and they that are wise shall shine as the brightness," or the Zohar, "of the firmament, and they that turn their many, and they that turn the many to righteousness, as the stars forever and ever." That's Daniel 12:3. The Zohar then goes on to comment upon this, and it says, "There was indeed a brightness, a Zohar. The most mysterious struck its void and caused this point to shine. This beginning then extended and made for itself a palace for its honor and glory. There it sowed a sacred seed which was to generate for the benefit of the universe, and to which may be applied the spiritual words, 'The holy seed is the stock thereof,' Isaiah 6:13. Again, there was Zohar, in that it sowed a seed for its glory, just as the silkworm encloses itself, as it were, in a palace of its own production, which is both useful and beautiful. Thus, by means of this beginning, the mysterious unknown made this palace. This palace is called Elohim. And this doctrine is contained in the words, 'By means of a beginning he created Elohim,' which is a way of interpreting in the beginning Elohim created. The Zohar says that the first words of the Bereshit bara Elohim, the first opening words in Hebrew of the Torah, can be read several different ways, and that's one of them. The Zohar then says, the Zohar is that from which were created all the creative utterances through the extension of the point of this mysterious brightness. Nor need we be surprised at the use of the word created in this connection, seeing that we read further on, and Elohim created man in his image, Genesis 1:27. A further esoteric interpretation of the word Bereshit is as follows. The name of the starting point of all is Eyah, I shall be. The holy name, when inscribed at its side, is Elohim. Thus, when inscribed by circumscription between the two Eyahs in Exodus 3:4, is Asher. In other words, Ezekiel 3:4 in the Hebrew says, Eyah, Asher, Eyah. I am that which I am. The hidden and recondite temple, the source of that which mystically is called Rashit, from the word Bereshit, Rashit, meaning the head. The word Asher, i.e. the letters Aleph, Shin, and Resh, which formed the word Bereshit, is anagrammatically Rosh. In other words, if you rearrange the letters, it's Rosh. And beginning, Rosh means head, and it's the root word for Bereshit, which is the first word in the Torah. The beginning of which issues from Rashit. So, when the point and the temple were firmly established together, then Bereshit combined the supernal beginning with wisdom. Afterwards, the character of that temple was changed, and it was called house, or Beit, which is the letter Beit is the first. The letter Beit is also the pictograph of a house, okay, which is the first letter in the Torah. The combination of this with the supernal point, which is called Rosh, gives Bereshit, which is the name used as long as the house was uninhabited. When, however, it was sown with seed to make it habitable, it was called Elohim, hidden and yet to bring forth. And the house was extended only so far as to find room for the holy seed, before it had conceived and had extended sufficiently to be habitable. It was not called Elohim, but all was still included in the term Bereshit. After it acquired the name Elohim, it brought forth offspring from the seed that had been implanted in it. So the book called the Zohar says that the Zohar is likened to a seed, which is elsewhere called in the Zohar the son of Yah, or the son of Elohim, in other words. The Zohar says that the most mysterious, or the infinite one, created a palace for himself called Elohim, into which he placed the Zohar, or the brightness, like a seed sowed of himself, in much the same way that a silkworm encloses itself in a cocoon. And this is what Paul is referring to. This concept is what Paul is then referring to and saying the Messiah is this Zohar, this brightness of his glory. Okay, I think that's as far as we're going to be able to get in today's class. Just the first 4 verses and an introduction to the general book. So in our next class, in part 2, we'll start to get into the first midrash, which is the topic of which is the Messiah humbled and exalted, which is a midrash on the phrase, Yahweh said to my Adonai, sit at my right hand, Psalm 110, verse 1a. Excuse me. So we will pick back up in our next class, and we'll start discussing then we'll start to cover, and we'll cover as much as we can, chapter 1, verse 5 through chapter 3, verse 6, which is the first of the several, the chain of midrashim presented in the book of Hebrews. All right? So again, I want to encourage you to support this work. These videos are free. This teaching is free, but it isn't free. It's free. It costs somebody something. So I'd like you to please consider supporting this work. It's time intensive putting this material together. It's also time intensive doing the work that we're doing here, putting these Hebrew and Aramaic texts up online, interlinear, keyed to their Strong's word numbers, and you can see the work that we're doing on that by going to HebrewAramaic.nt.com or to Nazarenespace.com, and you can click there's several tabs across the top. You can click on Hebrew Aramaic New Testament project, or you can interlinear, or you can we're also working on doing this with the book of Enoch, with the Apocrypha, and with the book of Jasher. And you can click on those as well and see the work that we're doing on those projects. So how do you donate? You can donate by going to Nazarenespace.com or NazareneJudaism.com or Hebrew Aramaic NT, I think it's .com, maybe .org. and clicking on the PayPal box in the upper right-hand corner. And you can donate just by clicking on the box and going through the process that way. Otherwise, you can donate by sending PayPal donations to the email address donations@wnae.org, or you can send donations by surface mail to Nazarene Judaism at Nazarene Judaism, P.O. Box 471, Hurst, Texas 76053. And I hope that you, like I said, you'll strongly consider supporting this work. And I'll see you next time to study the book of Hebrews. Shalom.